pleasure to be talking to you, George, after knowing you through the postal system and the email for some years. And I wanted to start by just asking you about your parents, your family, your early life, your childhood, anything that you'd like to say about that.
Yes, I actually would. I was born in York, Pennsylvania, which is about 85 miles west of Philadelphia in southern Pennsylvania. I have an older brother of 2 years and a sister who's 5 years younger than I am. We lived on a 700-acre farm. My father was a businessman in town, and it was rather pleasant, but I discovered much later, or understood much later, that I was actually living in a very dysfunctional family. So I always had escape routes. The first escape route was I always had a canoe and a pack and sleeping bags so I could get out quickly if necessary. And the other escape route was, of course, into, I became very much interested in Indians, particularly Blackfoot Indians, and read quite a lot about them. And so by the age of 12, I was really interested in anthropology and started to get deeper into anthropology. Couldn't make up my mind whether to be an archaeologist or a social anthropologist then.
You knew by the age of 12 that there was a discipline called social anthropology or anthropology.
I knew there was a discipline of culturalists. It dealt with the ethnography versus archaeology.
Did you?
Oh yes. And so I went on to Phillips Exeter Academy and did rather well in Latin. And my final paper was on using some of Fraser's concepts to analyze some material in the Aeneid. And I was told by a colleague of mine that he was so terribly out of date that I'd missed that paradigm. So.
Did you have any particular teachers who inspired you? This is often a pattern in people's lives. There was one master or colleague or whatever at school who really excited and interested you, or?
Certainly at the level of the Latin teachers, yes. I had two wonderful Latin teachers, Gillespie and Galt, but in terms of anthropology, there wasn't any at that time. But in reading about the Blackfoot Indians and other Plains Indians, the abuse which they had through their history by the Americans led me on into be interested in human rights now, what they call human rights now of indigenous peoples. Anyway, I mentioned I'd gone on to Exeter, and from Exeter on to Harvard. Before I went on to Harvard, I enlisted in the Army Air Corps, and I got one term in at Harvard before being called up, and I was in the service here in the States, and the war was over before I had finished training. And I was then discharged, and I went back to Harvard.
What is Exeter? You said you...
Phillips Exeter, it's a very intellectually elite, what you'd call public school, but what we call a private school in Exeter, New Hampshire.
So your parents were wealthy. What did they do?
I don't know if they were wealthy or not. It's a relative term, you know what I mean. No, they weren't wealthy, and not quite wealthy. My father was a businessman. He was a manufacturer, real estate, radio, media, various things. So, I don't know if you want major impacts in a person's career, but when I was at Harvard, I had an accident playing basketball and lost an eye, which therefore made, I was very interested in athletics, made life difficult the first few years back at Harvard. But at Harvard, I studied with Homans, with Kuhn.
Okay, so can I stop you?
Yes, please.
Let's have George Caspar Homans. What was he like as a teacher and person?
I found him extraordinarily stimulating. He was doing those things I wanted to do, the various thoughts that I wanted to pursue. He was a strange man in that he had this rather guffaw, laugh. It would sort of like, it would just sort of echo out across the yard. I mean, it was incredible. He was a very energetic, but you know, a strange Brahmin from Boston. I was interested at that point, and this, and we'll go back to Homans in this way. I was interested in that point in what was I would call the interaction school. Chaplain Kuhn, I knew Chappell. I don't know if you know Chaplain Kuhn's principle of anthropology. I was interested in that. I was interested in Homans' work on the social groups, and so I followed up on that. But now I'm going ahead because can I wait? I'd rather wait and go and talk about that when I return to Harvard and graduate school.
Yeah, that's fine.
After Harvard, I worked for a while with F.L.W. Richardson Jr., who was part of the Interaction School, working in doing workflow work. I was interested in applied anthropology and been a member of the Applied Anthropology Society for a number of years since then. However, I thought it would be useful with regard to my father's business interests, but he thought otherwise. And he wanted me to leave that kind of work and come work in the factory, which I did, and then went on to the Harvard Business School.
How long did you work in the factory?
About a year. At the Harvard Business School, my father died, and then, as usual in these situations, how do we manage these affairs after he died? He died when he was very early, he was 54. So my brother was wanted to take over, which he did. So I went on to the University of Pennsylvania, where Kuhn had migrated from Harvard. Kuhn was a brilliant man. I mean, he's so exciting to work with. And
what was Kuhn like? Because I was influenced by his work on Navajo witchcraft. And his Mirror of Man as well.
He was a good lecturer. He was doing work that I was not that much interested in, because I was still interested in the interactionist school. At that time, Doug Oliver was a figure in that school, and then he wrote the CY of Bougainville, which is an interactionist attempt to be more scientific in ethnography. I studied with Oliver, and Oliver was the one who put me on to ANU. I also worked with, Cora Dubois, but I'm thinking John Whiting there, and Cora Dubois. Cora Dubois for the region, Southeast Asia, and Oliver for social anthropology. At the museum, I met my current wife. My first wife from the business school era decided she didn't enjoy marriage and went her way. Laura was then working as secretary to J.O. Brew. Laura's grandfather had been director of Peabody Museum many years previously. And so when I discovered her in J.O. Brew's office, there was a certain amount of attraction there, and so we eventually got married. In 1957, we were married, and we headed up to Northwest Territories of Canada, going in and study a group of Indians called Hare Indians. I had talked with June Helm previously to find out if that was any ethnographic interest of hers, and if it wasn't, we would work there. She said it wasn't. So we started down the Mackenzie River in a canoe, and it's a 2,000-mile trip down. We got halfway when we learned that June Helm had flown in to the Hare community, which is around 15 people at that point, and I was working with the only English speaker at that time. So we turned around, got a lift back up to Great Slave Lake and into the Fort Ray, and started working with the Dog Rib Indians. And the Dog Rib Indians I went with them up into the Barren Lands for their caribou hunt. And then we came back, and I returned to Harvard. At that point, I was a little disappointed with the situation among the Dog-Group Indians because they've been so acculturated. They've been forced into resettlement areas by the government. The government schools was teaching them all the most wonderful things they should know, like Ring Around the Rosie and things like that. And I was appalled at what was going on, which I wrote a rather nasty letter to the, not nasty, rather blunt letter to the Commissioner of Northwest Territories. Let them have their own games, for God's sake. At Harvard, I was interested in, strangely enough, in the concept of corporation and corporate groups. And I wrote a paper on this, and I gave it to George Homans, and he was completely uninterested in it. And that's what struck me about the whole interactionist group. While it has a great deal to contribute to ethnographic fieldwork, none of them knew anything about durality or the importance of it. And so it really isn't a very fine tool for ethnographic research. I went to ANU to study actually with Derek Freeman because I was terribly impressed with his work on Iban agriculture, in which he described in the Iban social organization. When we got to Australia, Laura was pregnant. We had our first daughter out there, our eldest daughter, yes. And John Barnes, strangely enough, assigned me to Paula Brown. Now, Paula Brown and I were the same age. And Paula doesn't work in Southeast Asia. And I was confused. So I went to him and said, look, I really wanted to work with Derek, and so I did. And Derek was wonderful in preparation for the field. So we wanted to work in Borneo. We got approval for our research plans and headed up to a colony in North Borneo. And part of the problem with a wife and a 6-month-old, I had to find a location within a day's travel to a good hospital. So I was limited in where we could work. So I made a tour of the countryside, and there are people up there that are called Duzun, but actually they should be called Duzunic speakers because they're made up of a number of ethnic groups which speak a Duzunic language. So I toured the west coast and found the Rungus, who were the least acculturated, the least impacted. In fact, they were completely traditional. Many years later, my youngest daughter discovered in the attic of my mother's house the fact that I had been reading as a young man Boy's Life, which was a Boy Scout thing, and they had a series of articles on the Duzun people. I didn't remember it, but we ended up there. And then we worked among the Rungus, first time for 10, 11 months, and back to ANU for analysis of a preliminary analysis, and then back into the field until 63. One of the things I wanted to work in a cognatic society because I did not understand unilineal descent. I do not understand unilineal descent to this day, and I wanted to work in a cognatic society, so I was off to Borneo. I got my worst mark in anthropology under David Snyder at Harvard in his course on social organization, which was really unilineal organization. I got a B. And David and I never really got on about these things. So we worked with the Rungus, and came back to ANU and began writing up our data. At that time, Derek had gone through, and I'm not gone through his, I don't know what to call it, his confrontation with Tom Harrison. And going through it, he had sort of a abreaction, I think he called it, and he began to switch more to ethology and psychoanalysis. And he was uninterested in what my social anthropology was then doing. Back to ANU, writing my dissertation. Derek's disappeared, gone to London, as one of his colleagues says, to torment the primates in the zoo by tempting them and frustrating them and tempting them and frustrating them. I don't know what was going on, but John Barnes took over. John Barnes said, give an outline dissertation. So I wrote a very detailed outline of my dissertation. I submitted it to him and he approved it. I then wrote the first 2 chapters. I gave 2 seminars on it. At the end of it, John was very distraught. He says, this won't do it all. You'll just have to rewrite do another outline. Now, what I was trying to do, and I'm still working on this, is develop a method of analyzing societies which anyone can replicate. I don't like the concept of going and getting a theme. John said, for God's sake, just grab a theme and write around the theme. That's not what I was doing, because coming from this very scientific group of people who wanted to be scientific, make anthropology more scientific, the interactionists, Chappell, Kuhn, Homans, that's not what I was about. And he didn't understand that. And so smoke came out my ears when he didn't like what I was doing, since he had approved it. And I was very detailed, and I wrote to that detail. So I sat on it for about 2-3 months, rewrote another outline, which was the same outline with maybe some few different words, and he approved it again. John and I never agreed on Radcliffe Brown. Now, Radcliffe Brown wrote this very stimulating article in the Iowa Law Review, which was all wrong. He didn't understand, strangely enough, and I can explain that, he didn't understand law, and he didn't understand social groupings.
What was the article about? Was it a famous one?
A famous one on joint rights, that whole thing of how you classify rights.
Why didn't he, in what way didn't he understand law, and why didn't he?
Okay, all right. The term joint right in Anglo-American law specifically refers to a way of owning property in which rights, title are simultaneously entered.
Yeah.
When one person dies and leaves it, that right that the person participated in does not pass on to his heirs, but goes to the other co-right holder. And he was mixing up joint and rights in common and rights of common as opposed to rights in common. I was very confused. Now, I was trying to sort this out, and John Barnes got angry with me about this. And he didn't understand the importance of determining whether the group held rights as a corporate group or whether the rights were held by individuals. And we had several go-arounds about that. Finally, I think he just gave up on me and let it through. But I was surprised at that, because that makes a major difference in your analyses. So anyway, I finally came back, finished my dissertation here in the States because my fellowship was up, submitted it. Fred Agan and Hal Conklin were the readers.
So and you were registered in, your PhD was registered in the States, was it?
It was at ANU.
Oh, it was at ANU.
It was an ANU, but I was not there when it was,
Examined, yeah.
The examination when it was at Yale University. They picked 2 Americans to examine the dissertation. Well, I wanted to continue. We moved to Maine, planning to go back and continue our work among the Rungus because it wasn't finished. There was a lot of the religion, which was fascinating, which we couldn't get our hands on at that time. So we got this small little farmhouse in Maine. I got a research associate position at Peabody Museum, applied to the National Science Foundation for funding, got for a 3-year project of social change. They said, oh, no, we'll give you 1 year to write your material up. So we had 1 year to write the material up. And during that time, Saba, which was formerly the colony of North Borneo, closed down. No anthropologists were allowed in. We finally got a grant to go back work among the Rungus in 1980. I was declared persona non grata, put on a plane and shipped out. We never knew what happened to the wife and children. They grabbed a cab, went up to the Rungus to find out what was happening to them, because we'd heard all sorts of things that the government was working them over to convert them to Islam and things like that. But Laura and the 3 daughters went up there. We heard that one of my aide-de-camp had been beaten up by the police previously, so he went up there. I ended up in KL. I went to the ambassador. I said, look, find my wife and children. We don't know where they are. I had whispered to her that we'd meet in Brunei, and I was using this as a ploy to try to embarrass the government. They turned down the ambassador's call, the state. I mean, not the national, but at a state level, they refused the ambassador's call to find out what happened to wife, Laura, and kids. I finally ended up in Brunei, and a couple dozen speakers came on out to see me and told me what the problems were, this modernization, what was happening to them. And that gave me the idea for the book, Modernization, the Emergence of a Landless Peasantry. One person said, we're making a landless peasantry. So we left there and went to Australia. We had this grant for 18 months, year, 18 months, I've forgotten. We went to Australia. We were going to hit Australia when we were finished, but we went to Australia while we got permission to work in Indonesian Borneo. In Australia, I saw Derek. Derek was in a funk. He gave me his office to work in, and he was in a funk. He had reached a dead end on Margaret Mead. So I approached him on us doing a Festschrift for him, and he began getting excited about the Festschrift. We were there for about 2-3 months, I forget, and Wen worked in Indonesian Borneo and worked among the Belusu people. The first letter I got from Derek said he was re-energized and working on Margaret Mead again. So, to continue on this book, he then came to America to find a publisher. He visited us. He stayed with us for a while. He went to Princeton. I introduced him to some people at Harvard University Press, and they took it on. And that's sort of the history of that book. Yes, he's right. I don't think he made the best argument for it. Margaret Mead accused me of not knowing the ethics of anthropology because of my experience with June Helm, who had suggested that she wasn't interested in the Hare Indians and then found out she'd moved in. And then after a year or two started working among the Dog-Rib Indians. I was concerned about the ethics of anthropology and then Margaret Mead's claim I didn't know. So I started a series of cases, and I took them around to various meetings of the AAA and Northeast Anthropological. We had discussion of ethics cases, which resulted in the book. I was the first one to use ethics cases in the study of ethics of anthropology, and my book was stolen by a person who wrote a book on ethics. I love this. And I was at this conference in which we...
Your book was stolen, what do you mean?
I had a publisher,
yes.
And this chap became the publisher's in-house advisor. He was at Carleton College, I believe. And before I'd finished working up my book, his book well, let me put it this way. In holding these sessions, this chap, and I forget his name, you know, he's dead now, dear.
Which sessions are these?
This guy at Carleton College who sold away. Anyway, I was holding these cases, and he was there, and I said, and he started talking about some of his material. I said, would you like to participate? He said, well, send me the information. I sent him the information, and he used that, yes, and he used that information for his own book, without any reference.
What irony.
Yeah, a terrible irony. Several years later, there was a conference out in the West Coast on ethics, and the person who was organizing the conference read her paper, and there were sections right out of what I had written. And I told her so. Didn't seem to faze her. And I couldn't get her to remove it, or at least give me reference. So in my paper, I made that point. So, I mean, ethics, I really worry about people who talk too much about ethics. So, anyway, we were back at Harvard. Harvard was going through a very terrible period, terrific infighting among the faculty. But because of the tension at Harvard, I had left the year before for Brandeis. I said to Brandeis, look, I have this research project. Would you take it on? Were you interested? And so I moved to Brandeis, where I had some old friends that I'd known from the University of Pennsylvania. Anyway, I prepared this book on cognatic social organization. Now, my idea was to find out the scientific techniques, or develop techniques, methodology, that would enable anyone to duplicate what a previous researcher had been doing on social organization. It had to do with jural groupings. And you see, the trouble was that Radcliffe Brown had said early on that he didn't understand cognatic societies. He couldn't understand how they can work because there's no unambiguous assignment of status, et cetera, et cetera. And I collected a number of statements by people on this. And Gulliver is an example. He didn't know how to deal with a cognatic society. He finally came out years after he'd done the field work and using network theory. Peter Lawrence had a cognatic society in New Guinea, and he didn't, many years delayed in writing up his material. He didn't know what to do with it. Anthropology, particularly British anthropology, obsessed with kinship as a kinship lineage, as a way to enter and understand a non-literate society, and they were all wrong, of course. It got so bad that the BLEC, the major basic unit, household of the Rungus, of the Iban social organization, consisted of an elder, a child, a wife, children, and maybe some others, and other people moved in, and people started calling it a small lineage. Well, I mean, there are several books and use the term lineage for this group, which no way can be conceived as lineage. So this model of thing really confused people. I have a comment from a couple of anthropologists that I went in the field to study social organization, but it was cognatic. I didn't know what to do with it, so I did Levi-Straussian work. I mean, it was interesting. I don't know if it was a paradigm or a pattern exhaustion or what. But here at this point, when we really could make a major contribution to understanding social organization, people just shot off because they didn't know what to do with cognatic society. It was a problem they could have resolved, but they didn't. So anyway, I gave a paper on this in an ASA meeting in, I don't know where it was, in England. Sally Falk Moore was there, and the professor of jurisprudence criticized my paper. What I was doing was showing that Radcliffe Brown was wrong and some other things. And Professor of jurisprudence said, I don't understand it. When there's, I always use the term rights in common whenever I deal with indigenous peoples in Africa. Well, there are about 10 different ways rights in common can be construed. And he didn't understand that. And Sally Falk Moore did not understand it. She was sitting next to me, and when I was criticized for my attempt to explain this, she agreed with the professor of jurisprudence. So anyway, and the paper, Ian Hammett never published it, or would have been in discussion a long time ago. I waited for him to publish it in a couple of years and didn't. So anyway, this is terribly important when you're going to deal with resources. You've got to know the rights that are held over by what type of what type of jural entity, et cetera, et cetera. So it's terribly important. And along comes a common property which does none of this, and it's to the detriment of indigenous peoples.
How can you explain, it's rather like your ethics point, which
Yeah.
is that the last people you should listen to on ethics are people who write about ethics. It sounds, from my experience, the last people you should listen to on legal anthropology are people who proclaim themselves as, like Radcliffe Brown, and also Max Gluckman. His work is, to my mind, deeply flawed because he doesn't understand common law. All his work is based on Roman law distinctions, and therefore a lot of it is complete nonsense. I mean, his whole argument about the reasonable man and so on, he totally misunderstands the original article on which it was based by A.P. Herbert,
Mhm.
for instance, and gets it upside down
Mhm.
and then misuses it. So Gluckman, who set himself up as the great legal anthropologist, is mostly nonsense. Now, why is it that many, so you mentioned Sally Moore, why is it that many of those who write centrally on legal matters, is it that they thought that as amateurs they could get a grasp of the basic categories of law without bothering to really understand legal systems, and so they just come at it without due preparation, or because they're just using law as a tool without really wanting to?
When I was preparing for fieldwork among the Rungus, I came across a paper by the professor of jurisprudence at Melbourne. I think his name was Durham. He made the very interesting point that any system of thought must have its entities and a relationship between its entities. And in law, it's what they call person, and a personality is the sum total of the rights and duties. So that was very stimulating to me, and that's the basis of my work at determining who are the entities that have jural standing. You know, throughout this whole thing, there is not one person who asked the question, does this social grouping have jural standing? Can it enter into legal relations? No one asked this question. Even today, books on property come out and they never ask that question. So they just look at the social group and see it may have some kind of property, therefore it has legal rights. It's nonsense, absolutely nonsense. But the critical thing is, do they have jural standing? And you have to do hard work collecting jural cases and how are they resolved. And it takes a long time because it's not written, but this is what you have to do. And I don't think Sally Moore understands that. But anyway, this is social anthropology missed the boat at this point. They could have gone off one way, but they went off in 100 other directions because they couldn't solve this problem.
Didn't they later? I was lectured by Robin Fox, who worked in Tory Island, and we were taught that at last they'd solved the problem of understanding cognitive systems by basically assimilating it, talking about non-unilineal descent groups. In other words, that you had, as long as you understood that instead of as long as you kept the focus, worked out the focus, that you had ancestor-focused cognatic systems and you had ego-focused cognatic systems. In other words, I began to see how the system worked better, and that the problems of Radcliffe Brown and so on were now partially solved. But do you think I was being deluded in believing that?
I think he made an interesting contribution, but I don't agree completely with it. For example, among the Rungus, you don't have any descent groups at all. Furthermore, British were all upset, and so was Derek Freeman, on the concept, and Americans too, the concept of corporation or a corporate group existed in perpetuity.
Yes.
That happens to be a characteristic of it, but it's not the major desidera of a group. There are many corporate groups that exist for a short period. For example, among the Rungus domestic family, it exists, raises children, collects property from its results of its swidden agriculture, and on the when the two founders of it become too old, the corporate group dissolves, and they move in with a child. And the way it shows that it dissolves, the terms for the property they bring in immediately change. Before it was property of the family. As soon as they move in with the child, that property becomes property of their child. So I mean, it's clear cut, but it exists for not in perpetuity. So that's one of the things that got.
I think one of the pernicious influences actually is Henry Maine.
Yes.
I mean, I've written a lot about Maine, and
I'm anxious to read it.
And Maine's mistakes were corrected by Maitland, his successor in Cambridge, and he did some very good critiques of Maine. He pointed out that a lot of it is, because it's based on Roman law, it over makes it the corporate group too structured and fossilized and unflexible, and it also makes this over-strong distinction between status and contract, which the two, as Maitland famously said, you have a mixture. In all situations you have mixtures of status and contract, and never pure forms of either. And by making this dichotomy, and both historically in time and conceptually, and of course a lot of people like my reporters and others were very fond of Maine, and they didn't read this other critiques of Maine. So I think that led into a number of the mistakes you were talking about.
Yes, yes. I'd have to go back and review that literature because I've been working on my own materials. You see, you really do need an abstract analytical system to cross cultures. But once you have an abstract analytical system, which Halliwell did with his concept of property, you have to have observational procedures to fill it. In New Society, he never did the observational procedures. And that's what I've worked on for a number of years. I was in Australia, I want to go back. I was in Australia for a total of 5 or 6 years. During that time, I was not in touch with American anthropology, and this whole school out of Yale of cognitive structuralism arose with componential analysis.
Ward Goodenough.
Ward Goodenough,
Lounsbury.
and the other tall chap who works at the Smithsonian. I'll think of his name. But they came out with this. But they couldn't handle social action. I was working in Australia unbeknownst to what they were doing, and I was trying to do for social action what they were doing for culture. And but anthropologists here were all keyed up over their new tech methodology, and so the approaches I have never been really, people have not shown much interest in. About that time in the 70s, I was upset over what was happening to the Rungus. David Maybury Lewis approached me on becoming a member of Cultural Survival. He asked me to sit on the board, and I did. I think the main reason was for money, not for intellectual input. Anyway, he asked me to give some talks at Harvard on what you do with the survival of indigenous peoples. And he said at one of those things that there's nothing in applied anthropology is of any use at all for what we're doing. His wife, Pia, said anthropology is useless. What we have to do is too important. And things are too emergency, so anthropology is no good to us. So I prepared a paper explaining what I felt had to be done in foreign countries, which we have no power, and what we can do to help indigenous people. Cultural survival wanted to operate on the basis of the very themes, the very epistemes, the very ideas of Western society that are causing the trouble. They wanted to go down and improve the economics of these people. They were consumed by what I later called economic fundamentalism. And that is not what the people need to design their own future. They should be able to design their own future and not have economic fundamentalism thrust on them to improve them economically. I mean, one of the magnificent pieces of David Maybury Lewis's confusion is he went down and looked at a resettlement area, and he came back saying these people are living in wonderfully clean new houses. Nice square houses while they used to live in round houses. It was, so they really were focusing on, so anyway, when they fired me from the board, I then formed
Why did they fire you?
I have no idea, but they refused to accept. I laid out for the board a proposal which eventually led to the Anthropologist Fund for Urgent Anthropological Research, a proposal on what we should do as anthropologists. In other words, collect material on land tenure, things like that. Feed back the information, use their own medical system to feed into the modern medical system, get their own medical system going, because the support from their own medical system is so incredible. You know, placebos cure, what, 80% of the time? For God's sake, feed it back in, rather than destroying it. So anyway, I was fired. I was in touch then, and I don't know how, with Survival International, I was a member of it, so they suggested, Hamburg Tennyson suggested I form an organization here. So I did it in New York. And rather than any theme that cultural survival was involved in, I formed it on the basis of human rights. Now, it was very hard to get human rights interests on it with regard to indigenous people because, by God, they just needed to be progressive. They needed to be brought in the modern world. And the human rights are very conflicting. You have to provide education, but you can allow them to have their religion. But education destroys their religion, etc. And you know, the conflicts in human rights are incredible, the human rights documents. During this period, for 1 year, we were out, a year and a half, we were out among the Balusu, so my brother-in-law took over running of it, and it didn't go well, and anyhow, they were anxious to have me out, because they were afraid that, I think, that the American group would wag the dog in England. So I left that, and nothing further came up until I had the opportunity to sit on the Human Rights Commission of the American Anthropological Association. But by God, they were doing the same thing. They were basing, not on anthropological theory. David Mabry Lewis did nothing on the basis of anthropological theory. Siusa did nothing. Stephen Corey absolutely ridiculed anthropology, who was then executive director of Survival International. And the human rights group were doing exactly the same thing, taking action on the basis of our premises, on the basis of our ideology, which is, I mean, the general American ideology, Western ideology, which has caused the trouble in the first place. So, what do you do? Terry was on the board. Terry Turner was on the board, and he was obsessed with Chagnon. Les Sponsel was the chairman, and he was obsessed with Chagnon. And I finally resigned because they were not addressing the major issues of what does anthropological theory have to say about human rights. For example, it says nothing about sorry, it escapes me when you tear people down. Defamation. They say nothing about defamation. They say nothing about this destroying the psychology of indigenous people. They say nothing. But you have a right to be an individual. You don't have to be told you're dirty and nasty and brutal. You know. But they don't do that. They don't bring anthropological theory. And there's a whole theory which led to a paper on the health consequences of social change, which deals with the fact that people can change better if they can have their systems of adaptation supported and encouraged.
You mentioned just in passing Terry Turner's obsession with Chagnon.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know why there was this obsession? Were they rivals of for an empire in South America, or were there theoretical paradigm or personality, or was it all these things?
I really don't know. I think he was upset with the way Chagnon portrayed the people, because Chagnon was portraying them in a particular way to advance his own career and not necessarily how they actually were. Mm. And there's a lot of evidence that's true. But Chagnon is very pugnacious too. Les Sponsel is unpugnacious, so I don't know why he was so involved. I really don't know what on, because I don't follow South American anthropology.
But you felt that it was really a waste of time being on the board?
I felt they weren't addressing, all right, let me talk about one of the major issues in human rights, and that is cultural relativism. You have infibulation in certain groups in Africa. Is this right for the woman? Now, many anthropologists were arguing that infibulation, I think it was perfectly legitimate because that's their culture, and therefore it's not a violation of human rights. So I came up with a premise that a violation of human rights occurs when you lower the capacity of any group of people, or any individual lowers his capacity to adapt. Now, if you do infibulation, not many, some women die. That lowers our capacity to adapt. So on the basis of an anthropological analysis of their relation to their environment, their ability to adapt, it's not a very successful technique. So I think we should. But no one's addressed this issue, I think, sufficiently on cultural relativism. That's always used against people who are trying to deal with human rights. But there's all sorts of things about dehumanization. God, no one addressed the problem of dehumanization. We do that. That came up during the Vietnam War. You know, the literature on dehumanization among the of the gooks, and how it permits you to do things that you would not do to other people if they were part of your community. Well, no one talks about dehumanization of these indigenous peoples. 2 years ago, from the World Bank, came out a book on why we should respect these Islamic cultures and how important they are. I mean, that should have been at the beginning, not at the end. Anyway, yes. So frequently we go in there and we destroy their culture, we destroy their self-respect, we tell them they're no good, and they should be like us. And in the long run, I don't think it's the best way to deal with people. And I think it has many consequences, many health consequences you see with, and this is the thing which bothers me because it destroys their health systems and destroys their ability to cope.
What is very difficult, really, and that's why I'm mentioning it, is that for an ordinary anthropologist who doesn't know anything about cultural survival or these organizations which you join, their image of them is that they were precisely addressing the questions which you're talking about, and that the last thing they want to do is to impose economic fundamentalism or any Western things, because that's precisely cultural survival in the name, you know. Support their cultures, don't impose Western values on them and all the rest of it. So their literature and their fundraising and everything is based on that image of themselves, and yet your experience of being within them and being on their boards suggested that that wasn't what they were about.
Definitely not. And if you read their projects, it's not what they're about. Let me give 3 examples. They were introducing down in South America, there's a button you can make from certain nut, and they were trying to get full production of this. Well, as a result, you stratified the society. People were becoming in conflict with each other because some people were getting paid, others weren't, et cetera, et cetera. They did the same thing in Africa several times. And you just don't do it. You don't create conflict in a society. You give them the tools to choose their own futures, not give them the tools to choose your future, what you perceive their future to be. That's one. The other one was, there was a group going out, and I spoke to you about it yesterday, a group going out to help with the school system among the Kalahari, the San people. And I mentioned to them the problem in the Plains Indians, in which the kids going into the schools were beaten for attending trance dances. And I said, you ought to read the literature on this. And it was at that point that David Mary Lewis said, there's nothing in applied anthropology, any interest to it. So they went out there, and they came back about 3 years later. And this woman said to me, you know, the strangest thing happened. The teachers would get very angry at San people, kids who would go out to trance dances, and they would rough them up. So I mean, yes, it's so frustrating because no. But look at the projects that they support in their things, and they'll tell you what the hell's going on. They're not supporting people controlling their own cultures, controlling their own futures.
This must have been one of the things that you rather liked about Terry Turner, because the little I remember about him is that certainly one image of him is that he was keen on the Kayapos taking some control of their own destiny. Is that right?
Yes and no. His theory about societies constantly evolving is interesting, but he hasn't framed it in an analytical way that's useful. It's led to not his work. I have an article called Emergent Structuralism. And if you look at a society composed of social structure, which is the jural system, the opportunity system, and the anti-structure, pardon me, Turner, the anti-structure, there's an interrelationship between these going on. There's social action going on, agency, if you will. And if you have opportunities, people begin to fill those voids. And those voids, if they become too threatening, then there's juror action taken to control those voids. Antisocial action, for example, for years they were allowing, I mean, not for years, they were dumping on people smoking pot. Then they said, if you have your own, it's all right. Antisocial action was then being transformed into an acceptable behavior structure. So you have the problem of scanning. There's always scanning going on in society, and there is a constant emergence of social structure, the jural system, and the opportunity system, et cetera. I can give you examples of that in Borneo. I can give you examples of that in America. I mean, the one I'm most involved in, or what most knew about, was when Lady Bird started the road system here, that you couldn't have outdoor advertising along the roads, panels. People began tearing their hair in the industry. God, it's a disaster, we'll lose. But the strange thing is, it was the best thing for the industry. That opportunity was closed off. It opened up the opportunity of putting panels in areas that had been zoned for industry, and since they were scarce, you could increase the cost to the advertiser, and so the advertising companies, were better off with that, you see. So that's the interplay between opportunity, antisocial, and social structure, which creates the emergence. Terry just talks about them constantly changing and moving on. I don't think he's really I don't know his stuff, but I felt he pushed that much too far. But I could be very wrong. One other thing I would like to say, which I think is important, which no one else does apparently, is that we worked in Indonesian Borneo among the Belusu. They were being resettled. And what was happening to them was so horrible, I couldn't go back. I mean, the violations of human rights. They were hoarding people into the river and firing over their heads to bring them into resettlement. They were tearing down. They threatened to burn down houses. They didn't think I understood Indonesian. This guy, district officer, came in and said, if you don't move to the settlement, we'll burn down your longhouse, etc. It was just horrible. Anyway, we went into one of these resettlement areas. We came in by boat. God, it was just like a resettlement area in Canada. It was just like an Indian reservation. The houses were the same, the landing was the same. It was the most shocking thing. And from this experience, I ran a symposium on the reservation as a social type, equivalent to the family or the village or community, which has certain universal characteristics. For example, the thieving, corrupt administrator. I mean, it just goes right down. You find it everywhere. And I was hoping someone would pick this up and follow it out, because this needs to be studied as a social type. It occurs everywhere.
It's rather like some of that work by Mintz and others on plantation economies and the way in which the plantation structures are replicated all, with different crops all over the world. You have the same, I saw it in Assam tea plantations, you have the ideology, the physical structure is identical, whether it's in the West Indies or in Assam or whatever, with plantations. Plantations generate a kind of, there's almost a blueprint of what a plantation should be, whatever. The same with resettlement colonies.
Yes.
You could more or less write a manual of how you set up a reservation.
So, anyways, to go on to why we formed this thing, when the Human Rights Commission, the AAA, got going, I suggested that we should raise some money to support the activities of human rights. We could put people in the field. The then executive director was really very concerned about control. They were afraid the Human Rights Committee would run out of control, would cause trouble for anthropologists. I said, well, I'll go out and raise $100,000. He laughed at me and said, it can't be done, which made me very angry. So then I formed the Anthropologist Fund for Urgent Anthropological Research. The ideology behind it, the theory, the charter, is exactly what I presented to Mayberry Lewis. In fact, I cribbed right off of the thing I sent to the trustee, to the board at that time. Some minor changes, but essentially the same. and went around to see who would take it on. The AAA was not interested. What's her name at the Winter Gren was not interested. Sidell. Yeah, was not interested. I can't think of anyone else until Ida Nicolaus, a Danish anthropologist, suggested Jonathan, and so I went to Jonathan, and he just thought it was wonderful.
He came right over. And
So so that's how it's taken off.
Any final thoughts you'd like to have, and then we can have a quick
Okay.
talk to Laura.
Oh, all right.
About your current work, perhaps, or future work.
Current work, I have about 4 books in process, so I only have time to do it. The one on property, there's 2 books on property that I've been working on for years. I have so much data. Then we have this cultural dictionary of the Rungus. We have the oral literature of the Rungus. We have scads of it. I mean, we have a whole filing cabinet full of material. We're processing all our early photographs onto, and our current photographs, digitalizing them. We're digitalizing our tape recordings. When we went back in 1986, we finally were allowed back in 1986, the culture was gone. Very little of it was left. So then we had to work with older people. So we've been working with spirit mediums, priestesses, recording their gorgeous oral literature. I mean, their chants that go on for days. The music is so incredible. I've been trying to find someone who would write a symphony using the music. It's so incredible. I talked to Jonathan about that. He hasn't been able to come up with someone. So we're recording all their accounts, their historical accounts, their myths, their legends, this religious literature. And what we tried to do is get it from several different sources to see how it changes. See the difference in the sources, the standard techniques. So we have all this. We'll never be able to translate all this in our lifetime, but it's there. I formed there's no one place to handle Borneo materials, so I formed a foundation, and we'll use our office, and people can come up when we're gone, can come up and use it. We have Peter Gothel's stuff from Eastern Indonesia. We'll have our stuff from the Indians in Canada and also from Borneo. So it'll be all there, if anyone wants to. But I want to get these things out, particularly on the various themes in Rungus culture. Good. Oh, I do want to say one thing, if I can. The Rungus are wonderful people. You know they don't have a term for rape. They don't know what rape is. They're so egalitarian, it's incredible. I mean, they're just wonderful to work with.
George, 2 further things.
Yeah, actually, there'll be 3 further things. I would like to start off with saying that the Rungus is a very egalitarian society, and the women held a great deal of power and influence and handled the most beautiful oral literature I've ever run across. And if it hadn't been for my dear wife, Laura, that would never have been recorded or taken care of, because that was part of her job, to handle the religious literature of the priestesses and also helping with the dictionary. Now, to go on to some of the background to the Cobbold Commission, there was a district officer by the name of Robbie Beresford Pierce, who didn't know much about social anthropology or anything. And he walked down through the area and said, this place is completely uninhabited. He couldn't read the jungle. He didn't, the forest. He couldn't understand that it was fully occupied. And he was going to open up for Chinese settlement to shock the Rungus into modernization. Luckily, he left as we were moving into our second period of field work, and a new DO came in by the name of Colin Wood, who had an MS from LSE, and he was amenable to our discussions, and I was able to save about 50% of the Rungus land from Chinese settlement, because the Chinese wanted to move in close to Rungus so they'd have labor, set up plantations and have labor. So when Colin Wood came and approached me if I would serve as interpreter for the Cobbold Commission, I agreed because I thought highly of him. The Cobbold Commission was set up to investigate the plans of the British for decolonization and establishing Malaysia. And they wanted to supposedly get the thoughts of the people on the ground. I was asked to be interpreter for it. The Rungus were afraid to have a Muslim interpreter and a Malay interpreter. They thought they would twist what the Rungus were going to say. The British at that time sent up pamphlets about what was going to happen. And down near the capital, we were about 90 miles up from the capital, down near the capital were a group of Duzunic speakers called Kadazan. And they had formed themselves politically early on. And they tried to establish that all the Duzunic speakers in the country were Kadazan. Well, to the Rungus, the term Kadazan meant enemy. But anyway, the government sent out a pamphlet about the coming Malayanization that it was going to be Pogun Kadazan. Now, Pogun means a village destroyed and empty by the enemy. Kadazan is enemy. So this pamphlet about what was going to happen was rather scary to the local people. It was so stupid. Anyway, when we were called up to be the interpreter, we had been to a threshing party the night before, and we both had dysentery, and we were vomiting and coming both ways for about 36 hours. We were just living on ice because we had a small kerosene refrigerator. But we got up to the thing, and I was actually was dosed up with opium because I couldn't take the medicines at those times being used, emetine, for dysentery because it was hard on your heart. So we were living on opium. The native chief, who was Muslim, Malay, actually from the Philippines, had me knocked off as interpreter. The Rungus were in terror. He actually turned white. So after I was knocked off, the Rungus gave their deposition. I asked to give my deposition. So I sat down in front of Lord Cobbold, and his right was a Chinese and his left was a Malay. And I said that the way that it was being handled had people very much upset, and that if they weren't careful, they might lead into a kind of unfortunate anti-administration activities. And Lord Cobbold, looking down his nose, says, "My dear boy, the Malays don't fight. They never fight." Well, a few weeks later, the revolution started in Brunei. So now, this leads on to an article I wrote afterwards on anti-government activity, district administration and anti-government activity. And it was a disguised article, came out in Human Organization, saying how the flow of communication from the center to the peripheries, and if it was not fed back, would create certain tensions and would lead to anti-government feelings. That was published in Human Organization. A few years later, Thomas Rees Williams, who I'd criticized his work, wrote an article to Human Organization breaking the disguise, naming people, named the chief of state at that time, misspelled his name, and it was going to be published. I pled with the then editor, a woman from the University of Kentucky, I can't remember her name, not to publish it would cause lots of trouble. But she wouldn't listen to me. So at that time, the formal officer in charge of police in the district which we worked, who accompanied me in our first tour of the area to find a location for our field work, was here at Cornell getting his PhD. So I called him on the phone and said, "Look, would you do me a favor? Would you call up Margaret Mead and tell her this is absolute nonsense, because you know I was not engaged in any anti-government activity, because the article charged that I was the source of the anti-government activity. It was not the structure of government itself. And through Margaret Mead's good offices, it was withdrawn. However, I saw a copy of it, and I think it was circulated over to the country itself, and it may have contributed to the lack of the unwillingness of the government to allow anthropologists in."
One last question, since we have 5 minutes or so, which is that your life has always been, in a sort of way, skirting around the fringes of formal academic, you know, the internal world of academic anthropology, joining some of the organizations and then keeping on the edges. Do you see advantages in being in that position and disadvantages?
Yeah, there are terrible disadvantages. There's advantages and disadvantages of being on the edges. First of all, I didn't ever want to be on the edges. I wanted to be right in the center of things. But unfortunately, because of other demands on my time, I couldn't. I was not able to take up
That's the business activity.
I couldn't take up the standard procedure from assistant professor to professor because, furthermore, at that time, when I finished my PhD, I was 40, 39. The advantages are you can see certain things that are going on. The disadvantages are you're not in the exchange systems. So this professor at this university invites his friend from another university hoping to be re-invited in turn. So you're not in the exchange system that goes on. And that has certain problems.
I mean, again, looking back over the pattern of your life, do you have a sense of regret about, because you seem to have achieved so much and done so much and had such a rich and fulfilling life, that I would have thought it was a tremendous achievement, and you know, maybe you weren't in the heart of academia, but I can tell you there are some disadvantages to that too.
The lucky part, I didn't have to serve on committees.
That's right.
But I did miss graduate students. I've only had a couple graduate students. I had a top-notch one recently. I wish I'd had more graduate students. I think if I'd have lectured more, I refused to teach undergraduate courses because I knew my life was short, and considering the time I came into it, and I wanted to get as much research done as possible. And I didn't want to waste time teaching people who were not interested in anthropology but just getting their qualifications in. So I maintained only I would give reading courses, which I did, and I wish I'd had more students. It would have been much more fun. Yeah.
Good. Fine. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.